Tim Allen is a name we all know, famous for his humor and unforgettable roles on TV and in movies. But behind the scenes, there's a side to him that most of us have never seen, a side that's wrestled with loss, questions of purpose, and a lifelong search for meaning. Despite his fame, Tim felt something was missing, a deeper piece he couldn't find on any Hollywood set. Then, one unexpected night in Las Vegas, everything changed. A simple visit to a quiet church led to a moment that would alter his life forever. What exactly happened in that church? And how did it lead Tim Allen to embrace a faith he'd once ignored? So let me tell you about Tim Allen, the comedian we all know, the guy who's made us laugh on shows like Home Improvement and movies like Toy Story. But, behind the scenes, he's had some pretty deep questions about life. Yeah, Tim's journey isn't just all laughter and comedy. He's faced some real moments that made him stop and wonder what life is truly about. And honestly, who hasn't felt that way at some point? For years, Tim had buried these big questions about purpose and faith under his comedic routines. Sure, he'd heard about people having life-changing moments, those experiences that flip everything you thought you knew. But for Tim, those stories were just that, stories. He'd listen to them, maybe laugh them off, and then move on. But one night in Las Vegas, things changed for him in a way he couldn't ignore. It was like something had tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hey Tim, time to think about what really matters." And that's where it all began. This journey into something deeper, something beyond the spotlight and the laughter. Now, let's rewind a bit because Tim's story starts way back in Denver, Colorado, where he grew up. He wasn't just the funny guy from the start. His early life was marked by some pretty tough moments. When Tim was just 11, he lost his dad in a car accident. That kind of loss, especially at such a young age, shakes anyone to their core. It made him question things. Why do these terrible things happen, and if there's a God, how could he let it happen? Tim's family was Christian, and he went to church, but after his dad's death, he drifted away. The idea of faith felt distant, almost like a memory from someone else's life. He buried his pain deep down and found an escape in comedy, using laughter as a way to handle the darker parts of his life. As he got older, comedy became his shield, his way of coping. And hey, it worked for him. He became a big star, landed roles in popular shows, and even became the voice of Buzz Lightyear. But the fame didn't make life any easier. Behind the scenes, things weren't as glamorous as they seemed. Tim struggled with addiction and even had a run-in with the law. All these challenges painted a picture of a man who, despite all his achievements, was still searching for something to make him feel whole. He tried to fill that void with success, with money, with everything fame could offer. But somehow, it was never enough. Deep down, he felt like there was something missing. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It's funny, isn't it? People think fame and fortune solve everything, but for Tim, they just made him realize that the emptiness inside wasn't going to go away with applause or awards. He knew something was missing. He just didn't know what. As the years went by, Tim threw himself into his career, one success after another. Home Improvement made him a household name, and his role in Toy Story was iconic. People saw him as the funny guy, the one who always had a joke or a punchline. If anyone asked him about his beliefs, he'd probably laugh it off or give a clever answer to avoid going too deep, talking about his real feelings. That wasn't his style. But the fame and success, while amazing, came with a downside. All the applause and admiration gave him a rush, a quick hit that made him feel alive for a moment. But once the crowd disappeared and the laughter faded, he was left alone with that same empty feeling. No matter how high he climbed, he couldn't shake the sense that something was missing. He was always on, always performing, even when the cameras were off. Then, one weekend, he found himself in Las Vegas. It wasn't his usual scene. He wasn't there for a show or a big event. He just wanted to get away, take a break from Hollywood and clear his head. Staying at a hotel, he decided on a whim to walk into a local church nearby. He wasn't sure why he went in. Maybe he was just looking for some peace and quiet, or maybe it was something else pulling him in. Sitting quietly at the back, Tim watched as people gathered to sing a hymn. He noticed something different here. These people weren't there for a show. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were just together, connected in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. And for the first time, he didn't feel like the famous Tim Allen. He was just a person, sitting in the back, watching this simple, beautiful moment unfold. Then a young man stepped up to the front and started speaking. He shared his story, a story of hardship, loss, and finding strength when he thought he had none left. Tim listened, and with every word he felt something inside him shift. This wasn't some scripted Hollywood scene. It was real, raw, and filled with the kind of faith Tim had spent years brushing off. By the end of the young man's story, Tim felt his defenses break down. For years, he'd laughed off faith, kept it at arm's length, and buried those deeper feelings under humor and skepticism. But in that moment, in that humble church in Vegas, something touched him deeply. He felt a warmth, a peace he hadn't known before. When the congregation stood to say a final prayer, he realized there were tears in his eyes. He left the church that day feeling a little lighter, a little more open, as if something greater than himself had reached out to him. After that night in the Vegas church, Tim couldn't shake the feeling he'd experienced. It was like something had cracked open inside him, something he'd ignored for years. But life doesn't always make big changes easy, and for Tim, things didn't magically get better. If anything, he started facing setbacks that tested him even more. His career, which had been full of bright lights and steady applause, hit a few rough patches. Some of his projects didn't go as planned, and he faced criticism in ways he wasn't used to. Suddenly, the world didn't seem so stable, and even the comfort he'd once found in his fame felt shaky. He felt that strange sense of loss creeping back in, that empty feeling he thought he'd left behind. It wasn't just his career that was weighing on him. He was beginning to realize that the life he'd built around success and popularity was no longer enough to keep him going. It was like standing on a bridge you thought was solid, only to feel it start to sway. But maybe for the first time, Tim didn't try to ignore the feeling. Instead, he let himself sit with it, to think about the way he'd lived and the things he'd valued. The thought kept crossing his mind. Maybe that moment in the church hadn't just been a one-time feeling. Maybe it was a hint, a nudge, telling him he needed to take a deeper look at his life and ask himself what really mattered. One day, as he was still wrestling with all these feelings, Tim crossed paths with an old friend he hadn't seen in years. This friend was someone who had always seemed grounded, living a quiet, content life. They sat down for coffee, catching up on life's twists and turns. As they talked, Tim noticed something different about his friend, a kind of calm, an ease that felt rare, especially in Hollywood circles. His friend talked about his own journey, mentioning that he'd found a sense of peace through faith. It wasn't a preachy conversation. It was just an honest chat, like one friend sharing something real with another. This friend told Tim how faith had helped him through some of his hardest times, offering a place to turn when nothing else seemed to make sense. Tim was moved. He realized that maybe this sense of peace wasn't out of reach. He'd spent so many years dismissing faith as something that wasn't for him, but now, hearing his friend talk about it so naturally, it didn't seem so far-fetched. And just like that, another piece of the puzzle seemed to click into place for Tim. It was a simple encounter, nothing dramatic, but it stuck with him. As he left that conversation, he felt lighter, almost as if the weight he'd been carrying was starting to lift. He was beginning to see that maybe faith wasn't about rules or fitting into a certain box. Maybe it was about finding a deeper peace, a way to handle life's ups and downs without feeling so lost. That conversation with his friend, along with the experience he'd had in the church, led Tim to start exploring faith on his own terms. He didn't make any big announcements, didn't try to change overnight. Instead, he began taking small steps. He read more about spirituality, listened to people who had walked similar paths, and allowed himself to ask questions he'd ignored for too long. Slowly but surely, he started feeling a shift within himself. Tim began to understand that faith didn't have to be complicated. It wasn't about following a strict set of rules or pretending to be someone he wasn't. For him, it was more about finding that inner calm, that place he could turn to when life threw its curveballs. He'd spent so many years chasing the next big achievement, thinking it would make him happy. But now he was starting to realize that peace wasn't something you could chase. It was something you let into your life, something that grew when you opened yourself up to it. In July 2024, Tim had an interview with a well-known lifestyle commentator, and for the first time, he spoke openly about his journey with faith. He didn't label himself as religious or claim to have all the answers, but he shared that he'd found something meaningful, something that made him feel more grounded. He called himself a cultural Christian, someone who didn't necessarily hold all the beliefs, but who found value in the teachings and the peace that faith offered. Tim's honesty in that interview surprised many, but it also resonated deeply with people who felt the same way. He even shared that he encouraged others to seek out their own answers, to ask questions, and explore what faith could mean to them. It's about finding something real, he said, something that can keep you steady when life gets rough. It was a message that felt genuine, free of the gloss and polish, that often come with celebrity interviews. People could tell that this wasn't just a passing phase for him, it was a shift, a new path he was willing to walk, one step at a time.